In the middle of the 1990s, the digital world stood at a remarkable turning point. Computers were no longer used exclusively by universities, the military, or large corporations. More and more people were discovering the Internet, whose possibilities still seemed mysterious and almost limitless. Modems connected private homes to a worldwide network whose true dimensions were difficult for anyone to comprehend. To many, this new world felt like unexplored territory, a place whose rules had yet to be written. It was within this atmosphere that hackers emerged. Released in 1995, the film captures less of the technical reality of its time than the hopes, fears, and fantasies surrounding it. From a modern perspective, many of its visual ideas appear exaggerated. Screens become three-dimensional landscapes, streams of data resemble glowing tunnels, and computer networks look more like futuristic cities than quiet rooms filled with servers. Yet this artistic freedom reveals something important about how cyberspace was imagined during that period. The film does not begin with an ordinary introduction to its central character. Instead, we first encounter an exceptionally gifted boy named Dade Murphy. Even as a child, he is capable of writing a program that brings numerous computer systems to a halt. As a consequence, he is forbidden from using computers for several years. The opening has almost the quality of a fairy tale. A young hero is separated from the world that fascinates him most deeply. Only when he reaches adulthood is he allowed to return. 7 years later, Dade moves to New York with his mother. At the same time, the court-ordered ban finally comes to an end. Almost immediately, he reconnects his computer to the telephone network. There is little conventional drama in the moment. Instead, it carries the quiet feeling of coming home. For Dade, the computer is not simply a machine. It is a doorway into a world where he can discover and express his identity. Identity itself becomes one of the film's central ideas. Almost none of the young hackers use their real names within their digital community. Instead, they adopt striking aliases such as Crash Override, Acid Burn, Serial Killer, Lord Nikon, or Phantom Freak. In doing so, they create second personalities for themselves. Long before social networks became a familiar part of everyday life, hackers explored an idea that now seems almost natural. In the digital world, identity can be deliberately constructed. This creates a community defined less by background or social status than by knowledge and creativity. Those who are particularly skilled at programming or discovering security weaknesses earn recognition. The rules of this world are different from those outside it. Experience matters more than age. Ideas matter more than possessions. The film draws loosely from the hacker culture of its time, although it romanticizes that culture considerably. At the heart of this culture is curiosity. The young hackers do not see themselves as conventional criminals. They see computer systems as puzzles waiting to be understood. This attitude resembles what became known as the hacker ethic, which developed within American universities during the 1960s. There, exploring technological systems could be understood as an expression of creativity and a desire for knowledge. The film draws upon these ideas, though it simplifies them considerably for the purposes of its story. As a result, the boundary between ethical exploration and criminal intrusion becomes deliberately blurred. Just as important as the computers themselves is the city of New York. It is not merely a backdrop, but something closer to a living organism. Subway stations, skyscrapers, rooftops, and streets form an urban landscape filled with movement and energy. The camera frequently observes the architecture from unusual perspectives. Steel, glass, and neon light merge with the glow of computer monitors, creating a single visual language. Fashion and music contribute just as strongly to this atmosphere. Bright clothing, distinctive hairstyles, and electronic sounds reflect the cultural diversity of the 1990s. The soundtrack combines techno, industrial, and electronic music with an almost dreamlike lightness. Technology, therefore, does not appear entirely cold or threatening. Instead, it becomes a means of expressing freedom, creativity, and individuality. There is also an important contrast between the adults and the young people. Authorities, security services, and corporations are often portrayed as slow-moving and bureaucratic. The young hackers, by comparison, appear flexible, creative, and spontaneous. This contrast belongs to a familiar pattern found in many youth films of the period. At the same time, it reflects a broader cultural change. While institutions were still trying to understand computers primarily as tools for work, many young people were already beginning to see them as part of their everyday lives and their culture. From a modern perspective, Hackers possesses a particular historical value. The technology of the real world developed in very different ways from what the film imagined. Modern networks are largely invisible and quiet, operating without the spectacular visual effects that define the movie. Yet Hackers capture something essential about the spirit of its era. It conveys the feeling that an entirely new world was opening, a world whose possibilities could hardly be measured. Many later films about computers and virtual realities would use similar visual ideas or carry them further. The combination of urban aesthetics, electronic music, and digital landscapes left a lasting mark on popular culture. For this reason, Hackers is remembered less for technical accuracy than for its distinctive atmosphere and for the optimism with which it looked toward a future that in the mid-1990s was only beginning to take shape. With Dade Murphy's return to the world of computers, the central story of the film truly begins. Yet it does not unfold like a conventional crime story. Instead, it becomes a journey through different layers of a society that is only beginning to understand the value of digital information. Soon after arriving at his new school, Dade encounters a group of like-minded people. Each of them possesses particular abilities and a distinctive personality. Together, they do not form a strictly organized community, but rather a loose network. What connects them is their fascination with computers, their enjoyment of experimentation, and their desire to push beyond technical boundaries. What is striking is that their meetings rarely take place in traditional spaces. Instead, they encounter one another in clubs, on the rooftops of New York, or in front of their computer screens. Their community is not created by a fixed location, but by shared interests. This idea feels remarkably modern today. Many digital communities of the 21st century function according to a similar principle. People find one another through common passions, regardless of where they come from or where they live. Within this group, a playful rivalry soon develops between Dade and Kate Libby, known in the digital world as Acid Burn. Both are exceptionally talented. Neither wants to be outmatched by the other. Their small competitions initially seem harmless, almost like games, yet they serve an important purpose within the story. The film suggests that knowledge is not only a form of power, but also a source of recognition. Those who can think creatively or understand a difficult system earn respect within the group. The reward is less about material success than about intellectual achievement. This reflects an idea associated with the early hacker culture, in which technical ability carried considerable prestige. The story takes a decisive turn when a younger hacker accidentally copies an unusual file while breaking into a corporate network. His intention is relatively harmless. He simply wants to take a program with him. Instead, he obtains information that could expose a large-scale scheme of fraud. This is where the central conflict of the film begins. The company's head of security immediately understands the danger. He knows that the stolen file could reveal his own criminal activities. He therefore attempts to eliminate every trace of what has happened. At the same time, he directs suspicion toward the young hackers. There is an interesting symbolism within this situation. Technical knowledge suddenly ceases to be merely a game or a hobby. It becomes a tool capable of threatening powerful institutions. The young hackers possess very little political or economic influence. Yet they have something that corporations and authorities have underestimated: an understanding of digital infrastructure that, in certain situations, is deeper than that of the people officially responsible for it. In this way, the film touches upon an idea that was becoming increasingly visible during the middle of the 1990s. Computers were beginning to alter traditional relationships of power. Information could be copied, transmitted, or concealed without any visible physical form. Someone with access to the right data could, under certain circumstances, possess more practical influence than a person holding an important official position. At the same time, the film makes it clear that technology itself is neither good nor evil. The same networks can be used to share knowledge or to conceal crimes. What matters is the intention of the people using them. This moral neutrality of technology is one of the more interesting aspects of the film. Computers have no ethical position of their own. They simply expand the possibilities available to their users. Today, this idea may seem almost self-evident. In the early years of the digital age, however, it carried a different kind of uncertainty. The company's security chief represents the opposite of the young hacker group. He too possesses considerable technical knowledge. But while the teenagers explore systems out of curiosity, he deliberately uses his abilities for manipulation. He fabricates evidence, monitors other people, and abuses the authority attached to his position. The conflict, therefore, is not really between technology and humanity. It is between two fundamentally different ideas about how knowledge should be used. The portrayal of the authorities is equally revealing. The FBI is not presented as an all-knowing institution, but as an organization struggling to keep pace with a rapidly developing technological environment. Many investigators understand the digital world only partially. As a result, misunderstandings, premature accusations, and incorrect assumptions begin to shape the investigation. From today's perspective, this portrayal may appear simplified. yet it reflects the uncertainty surrounding a relatively new phenomenon. Cybercrime was still an emerging concept. Laws, investigative procedures, and technical expertise were developing gradually as institutions attempted to understand a world that was changing faster than many of them could anticipate. Another interesting element is the role of the media. Again and again, the film demonstrates how quickly public perception can take shape. Individual hackers are transformed into suspected criminals before the actual circumstances are fully understood. In doing so, the story presents an early reflection on the power of digital information and public narratives. Social networks did not yet exist in their modern form, but the underlying idea was already there. Those who control information can often influence the way reality itself is perceived. During the second half of the story, the events increasingly become a race against time. The hackers attempt to prove their innocence while exposing the person actually responsible. They rely less on physical strength than on cooperation, creativity, and trust. This is where the film reveals its surprisingly optimistic outlook. None of the characters could resolve the conflict alone. Only by combining their different abilities do they have any chance of confronting the power of a major corporation. Each member of the group possesses a particular specialization. One has an extraordinary photographic memory. Another understands telephone networks in remarkable detail. Someone else thinks analytically or remains calm when circumstances become difficult. The film therefore presents the idea that complex challenges are rarely solved by a single genius. Strength emerges from the combination of different talents. That message has remained relevant. Modern software development, cybersecurity, and scientific research also depend upon collaboration and the exchange of different perspectives. Seen from this perspective, the central crime story almost becomes a framework for something larger. The fraud provides the narrative structure. At its heart, however, the film is about a generation of young people beginning to understand a new digital world, while many established institutions are still underestimating its significance. This is part of what gives hackers its enduring appeal. The film is ultimately less concerned with computers themselves than with a historical moment in which technology was becoming a force capable of reshaping society. Its technical details may have aged considerably. The feeling of standing at the edge of a changing world, however, remains remarkably timeless. The story of hackers is not carried solely by its central conflict, but by its characters. They are not realistic portraits of the hacker scene of their time. Instead, they are deliberately stylized figures. Each one embodies a particular attitude toward technology, knowledge, and personal freedom. Together, they create a picture of a digital generation that in the middle of the 1990s was only beginning to shape an identity of its own. At the center stands Dade Murphy. His hacker name, Crash Override, refers to an event from his childhood that continues to shape him long into the present. The spectacular computer incident that once resulted in his court-ordered ban from using computers is far more than a piece of backstory. It influences the way Dade understands himself. He lives with the awareness that his extraordinary talent can also become a burden. What is remarkable is that his abilities do not seem to come from ambition. Instead, he appears to be driven by a deep sense of curiosity. Computers are not simply machines that execute commands. To Dade, they resemble complex landscapes whose structures invite exploration. To fully understand a system means discovering not only what it can do, but also where its boundaries lie. This attitude reflects a widespread idea within early hacker culture. Many of its participants described entering computer systems not as an act of destruction, but as a form of learning. Of course, this did not mean that every intrusion was legally or ethically harmless. Yet the film adopts this perspective and makes it an essential part of its central character. Kate Libby, better known as Acid Burn, serves as Dade's counterpart. She is one of the most experienced hackers in the group and commands considerable respect. For a film from the 1990s, her character possesses a remarkable degree of independence. Kate is not defined by her relationship with the male protagonist. Instead, the two initially encounter one another as rivals. Their first meetings resemble a quiet competition. Each tries to outmatch the other technically, yet beneath the rivalry lies something closer to mutual recognition. Slowly, competition gives way to trust. What makes this development particularly interesting is how quietly it unfolds. The film largely avoids melodramatic conflict. Instead, their relationship grows out of shared thinking and the challenges they experience together. In this sense, Hackers presents a rather unusual idea of intimacy. Connection is not created through grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but through understanding. The other members of the group also possess clearly defined characteristics. Serial Killer stands out through his open and humorous personality. Beneath his relaxed exterior, however, lies a deep loyalty toward his friends. He repeatedly lightens the atmosphere without undermining the seriousness of what is happening. His character serves as a reminder that technical ability and human warmth do not have to exist apart from one another. Lord Nikon possesses an extraordinary photographic memory. He can recall the smallest details and retain information with remarkable precision. Within the film, this ability almost appears supernatural. In reality, there are people with exceptionally developed powers of memory, but the movie deliberately stylizes this characteristic. It becomes a symbol of the many different forms that knowledge can take. Phantom Freak, meanwhile, is particularly interested in telephone networks and communication technology. Today, this specialization feels almost like a relic from another technological era. During the early 1990s, however, so-called freaking did play a significant role within certain circles of hacker culture. It involved examining telephone networks and exploring their technical characteristics. The film draws upon this historical element while combining it with its own highly stylized approach to storytelling. Perhaps most importantly, none of these characters is presented as a solitary outsider. In many later films, the hacker would become the isolated genius, sitting alone in front of several monitors. Hackers offers a different image. Its characters talk, laugh, argue, and support one another. Their greatest strength does not lie in individual genius, but in the trust that exists between them. The result is almost a kind of modern workshop of knowledge. Each person brings a different ability. Only their combination makes more complex solutions possible. Opposing them is the film's antagonist. As the head of security at a major corporation, he possesses extensive technical knowledge as well. At first glance, there is little that separates him from the young hackers. He understands computer systems just as well and moves confidently through digital networks. That similarity is precisely what gives his character its narrative purpose. The film demonstrates that technical knowledge has no inherent moral value. What matters is how that knowledge is used. Dade and his friends explore systems out of curiosity and eventually attempt to expose a fraud. The security chief uses those same abilities for deception and personal gain. This contrast avoids a simple division between good and evil. Both sides possess similar tools. The difference lies entirely in the choices they make. In doing so, the film touches upon a philosophical question that remains relevant today. New technologies do not automatically transform the morality of a society. They simply create new possibilities. Responsibility begins with the person who chooses how those possibilities will be used. The role of adults throughout the film is equally interesting. Many teachers, police officers, and investigators are not portrayed as malicious. Often, they simply lack an understanding of a world whose rules are changing faster than they can learn them. Here, a generational conflict emerges that extends far beyond computers. The young people speak, in a sense, a new language. They think in terms of networks, programs, and digital relationships. The older generation is more accustomed to traditional hierarchies and clearly defined responsibilities. Neither side is necessarily wrong. They are simply looking at the same reality from different perspectives. From today's point of view, this conflict feels remarkably familiar. Developments such as artificial intelligence, social networks, and digital currencies continue to create situations in which technological innovation moves faster than society's ability to adapt. Another recurring motif is the question of one's own name. Almost every important character uses a pseudonym. These names are more than simple nicknames. They symbolize the possibility of redefining oneself within the digital world. The ordinary realities of everyday life become less important. What matters is the ability a person possesses and the reputation they build within the community. Today, this idea seems almost self-evident. Usernames, avatars, and digital identities have become ordinary parts of everyday life. In the middle of the 1990s, however, the concept was still relatively new. Hackers recognized early on that digital spaces could allow people to reveal different aspects of their personalities and deliberately shape the way others perceived them. The film nevertheless remains remarkably optimistic about this possibility. Digital identities do not replace real life. They expand it. Friendships do not exist exclusively behind screens, but continue into the physical world. Computers do not necessarily separate the characters from one another. Instead, they create new ways for them to meet. This is one of the qualities that distinguishes hackers from many later stories about technology. The film does not primarily regard computers as threats or as sources of social alienation. Instead, they appear as tools through which people can express their creativity, experience community, and solve problems together. This hopeful perspective may be idealized, yet it reflects the spirit of an era in which the internet still seemed, to many people, like a place of almost unlimited possibility. Before questions of disinformation, mass surveillance, and algorithmic influence became central to public discussion, there was often a stronger belief that free access to information could also mean greater freedom for the individual. The characters of hackers embody precisely this hope. They are less realistic representations of a particular subculture than symbols of a generation that believed knowledge should be shared, that creativity could be stronger than rigid hierarchies, and that technology could bring people together when used responsibly. When we speak of computer networks today, most people think of invisible processes. Data moves silently between servers, fiber optic cables, and wireless connections. Most of these processes remain hidden from human sight. In hackers, however, the same world is presented in an entirely different way. Here, the invisible takes on a physical form. Data becomes light, networks become landscapes, and computers become gateways into a new realm. This visual interpretation is one of the film's most distinctive characteristics. From a technical perspective, the images shown on screen obviously do not correspond to reality. Computer programs do not create floating tunnels of light, and information does not travel through futuristic cities as visible streams. Yet these images serve an important narrative purpose. They make visible something that normally cannot be seen. The film translates abstract technology into a language of architecture, movement, and color. This idea has a long cultural history. Whenever human beings have encountered something invisible or difficult to comprehend, they have created images that allow them to imagine it. Ancient cultures depicted underworlds and heavens. Later artists imagined cosmic spheres and spiritual realms. The cyberspace of hackers belongs to this same tradition. It is less a technological location than a symbolic landscape. The word cyberspace itself existed long before the film. The writer William Gibson introduced the term in his 1982 short story, Burning Chrome, and brought it to worldwide attention 2 years later through his novel, Neuromancer. There, he described a virtual realm that people could enter mentally, a shared world of information perceived almost like a physical landscape. Although Hackers tells a very different kind of story, it clearly draws upon this idea. Its networks do not resemble technical infrastructure so much as a second reality existing alongside the physical world. The use of color is particularly revealing. Warm shades of orange and yellow meet cold blues, vivid greens, and luminous violets. These colors have no actual technical meaning. Their purpose is entirely atmospheric. As a result, cyberspace does not appear either threatening or sterile. Instead, it feels alive, almost organic. The movements within this digital world also resemble journeys through cities or tunnels more than the transmission of individual packets of data. The film is not attempting to teach its audience how computer networks function. It is trying to create a feeling, the sensation of limitless speed and seemingly endless possibility. This visual language reveals a great deal about the hopes of the period. In the middle of the 1990s, the internet was still largely unfamiliar to many people. Only a small number could truly imagine how a worldwide computer network operated. This uncertainty encouraged artistic visions in which the network became a mysterious realm. In films, novels, and video games, the digital world was often imagined as a new dimension, comparable to an ocean, a labyrinth, or an undiscovered planet. Hackers is one of the most recognizable examples of this development. It is also striking how closely the film connects its physical architecture with its digital imagery. New York is made of canyons of streets, skyscrapers, bridges, and tunnels. Cyberspace reflects these same forms. Data appears to move through corridors resembling the paths taken by people through the city. The result is the impression that the two worlds are somehow connected. This parallel carries a symbolic meaning. For centuries, the city has represented connection. Streets bring buildings, people, and ideas together. The internet simply extends this principle across the globe. The film makes this relationship visible by allowing urban architecture and digital landscapes to flow into one another. The camera reinforces this impression. Quiet images of the physical world repeatedly give way to dynamic sequences within the digital realm. There is no absolute dividing line between the two. Instead, they begin to feel like different sides of the same reality. Another important aspect is the disappearance of physical boundaries. Once someone connects to a network in the film, information can reach the other side of the world within moments. Geographic distance loses much of its meaning. This was one of the great promises associated with the early internet. Knowledge, in principle, could become accessible beyond national borders. Of course, that hope has only been realized in part. Political, economic, and legal differences continue to shape the digital world. Yet digital communication has genuinely transformed many forms of international cooperation. The film anticipates this development without explicitly explaining it. From a philosophical perspective, cyberspace also raises another question. Where does reality actually begin? If people form friendships, work together, or confront one another, does it fundamentally matter whether those interactions take place in a physical room or through digital connections? Hackers does not provide a direct answer. Instead, it demonstrates that digital encounters can have very real consequences. Decisions made through a computer can alter lives beyond the screen. The boundary between the two worlds therefore becomes increasingly permeable. This observation feels remarkably relevant today. Banking, communication, education, medical services, and cultural exchange all take place, at least in part, through digital networks. What once appeared to be a futuristic vision has become an ordinary part of everyday life. Yet the film remains faithful to its poetic visual language. It is not interested in technical precision. It is interested in human imagination. In a sense, its cyberspace resembles the old maps of the oceans. Early cartographers often filled unexplored seas with fantastical creatures and mysterious islands. Not necessarily because they believed they had encountered such beings, but because these images expressed the feeling of entering the unknown. Hackers approaches the digital world in much the same way. The glowing tunnels, geometric structures, and floating patterns of data tell us less about actual computers than about human curiosity. They reveal how a society imagined a completely new technology before that technology became ordinary. From a modern perspective, This is perhaps where much of the film's fascination lies. If Hackers is judged only by its technical accuracy, its greatest strength can easily be overlooked. Its imagery is not a textbook of computer science. It is an expression of the cultural imagination that accompanied the beginning of the digital age. And that imagination was deeply optimistic. The network appeared as a place of free ideas, open communication, and almost limitless possibilities. Many of the difficulties now associated with digital platforms were still difficult to foresee. Because of this, the film preserves an almost carefree vision of the future. Perhaps this is part of what has allowed it to retain its cult status. It reminds us of a historical moment when the internet was perceived less as everyday infrastructure and more as a mysterious new territory. A place that had not yet been completely mapped, whose possibilities seemed greater than its risks. In this sense, Hackers is not merely a film about computers. It is a film about something much older. The human desire to enter unknown spaces and approach their mysteries with curiosity rather than fear. Beneath its colorful surface, Hackers tells a story that reaches far beyond computer technology. Many of its recurring elements can be understood as symbols. The film raises questions about freedom, control, knowledge, and responsibility, questions that have occupied human thought for centuries. The digital world merely provides a new setting for ideas that are much older. Even the word hacking carries a double meaning. In everyday language, it is often associated with unauthorized access to computer systems. Within early hacker culture, however, the term could describe something rather different. A creative engagement with technology, the solving of complex problems, and the satisfaction of understanding a system completely. The film largely adopts this second perspective. Its central characters are less interested in destruction than in discovery. They want to understand how things work. They do cross boundaries, but their motivation usually comes from curiosity rather than personal gain. Here, the film introduces one of its first philosophical questions. Is knowledge dangerous in itself? Or does danger emerge only through the way people choose to use that knowledge? The film answers indirectly. The same technical abilities can be used to uncover the truth or to conceal it. The tools remain identical. It is only through the decisions of their users that those tools acquire a moral direction. This idea recalls many earlier technological developments. Writing could promote education, but it could also be used for propaganda. The printing press made knowledge more accessible while also making it easier to spread false information. Electricity brought light to cities, while the same scientific progress contributed to the development of machines of war. Technology has no moral character of its own. It simply expands the possibilities available to human beings. Another central theme is freedom. The young hackers experience the internet as an open space. Its rules differ from those of everyday life. Boundaries seem capable of being crossed. Information can move freely. Identities can be reshaped. There is almost something utopian about this vision. It recalls the hopes of many early pioneers of the internet, who believed that global communication might weaken traditional social hierarchies. Knowledge could become freely accessible. People could connect with one another regardless of their background, age, or social position. This vision was never universally accepted. Even then, there were concerns about abuse, surveillance, and the concentration of power. But the film deliberately chooses the more optimistic perspective. Against this idea of freedom stands the theme of control. The antagonist attempts to conceal information and prevent access to the truth. His power does not primarily come from physical force. It comes from his ability to control data. In this way, Hackers draws upon an idea that existed long before the digital age. Knowledge means power. The phrase is often associated with the English philosopher Francis Bacon, although his actual ideas were more nuanced. The film translates the principle into a modern environment. Those who possess information, or choose to withhold it, can influence the reality experienced by others. It is significant that information in the film is so often represented almost as light. Again and again, data appears as luminous structures moving through darkness. Light has carried symbolic meaning for thousands of years. It can represent knowledge, truth, and orientation. The antagonist, by contrast, attempts to create darkness. He removes traces, falsifies evidence, and conceals connections. His real objective is not to create knowledge, but to prevent knowledge from becoming visible. This gives the film an almost classical narrative structure. The conflict is not decided by swords or weapons, but by truth and deception. The hacker aliases also possess a symbolic quality. The characters choose names that do not completely describe who they are, but emphasize certain aspects of their personalities. In doing so, they create a second identity. Philosophically, this recalls the ancient question of whether a name determines a person or merely serves as a kind of outer shell. Within the digital world, that question takes on a new dimension. When someone chooses a username, they consciously decide how others should perceive them. The film suggests that identity is not necessarily fixed. It emerges through the interaction between how we see ourselves and how others see us. Today, this observation seems almost self-evident. On social networks, in online games, and within virtual communities, millions of people deliberately shape their digital identities. Hackers anticipates this development long before it becomes an ordinary part of everyday life. The city itself functions as another important symbol. New York appears like a living network. Streets intersect, people encounter one another, and information is constantly moving between different places. Its architecture therefore mirrors the structure of digital systems. This parallel suggests an interesting interpretation. Perhaps cities and computer networks are not fundamentally different. Both connect people. Both allow exchange. Both continually grow and change. Only the medium is different. The theme of speed is equally important. Information moves through the film almost instantaneously. Decisions have to be made quickly, and yet the characters themselves remain surprisingly calm. At first, these two qualities may seem contradictory, but there is a quiet idea within that contradiction. Technological progress accelerates the movement of information. It does not necessarily have to accelerate human thought. The central characters often act deliberately. They discuss their options, develop strategies, and rely upon one another's trust. In this way, the film distinguishes between the speed of technology and the slower process of making responsible decisions. That idea remains relevant today. Never before have news, images, and opinions been capable of spreading as rapidly as they can in the digital age. The faster information moves, the more important it becomes to examine it carefully rather than allowing every human reaction to follow the speed of the technology itself. There are also mythological parallels within the story. The journey of the central characters resembles, in several ways, the structure of a traditional hero's journey. They leave their familiar world, face trials, find allies, encounter a powerful adversary, and eventually return with new knowledge. The difference is that their journey does not lead through forests or distant kingdoms. It leads through digital networks. Cyberspace therefore takes on a role that mysterious forests, caves, and oceans often played in older stories. It becomes the unknown realm in which human beings can discover something about themselves. And throughout all of this, the film remains fundamentally hopeful. Even when systems can be abused, even when power becomes corrupt and information is manipulated, hackers never completely abandons the belief that cooperation, creativity, and openness can ultimately prove stronger. Perhaps this is part of the reason the film continues to resonate with audiences. It does not present a perfect future. Instead, it presents a world filled with possibilities in which every technological development also creates an ethical choice. That is why its central message can still feel timeless. It is not computers that change society. People change society with the tools they create. And perhaps the real responsibility of every new generation is not merely to develop better technologies, but to learn how to use them with greater care and wisdom. Anyone watching Hackers for the first time today will quickly notice how far the film has drifted from the way modern computer systems actually function. Screens seem to explode with color. Data flies through virtual spaces as glowing objects, and complex security systems can apparently be overcome within moments. From the perspective of modern cybersecurity, much of this feels like imaginative exaggeration. But judging the film purely on technical accuracy would miss much of what makes it interesting. Hackers was never intended to be a lesson in computer science. Instead, it tries to capture a particular feeling. To understand that feeling, it helps to look at the real computer world of the early 1990s. At the time, the internet was still undergoing rapid growth. Many private households were encountering computers for the first time. Access to the network usually came through modems connected to telephone lines. Even the act of connecting carried a certain sense of occasion. The characteristic whistles and crackling sounds of a modem announced that a connection to a distant digital world was about to be established. Transmission speeds were extremely slow by today's standards. Websites loaded gradually. Images often appeared line by line. Large files could take many minutes or even hours to download. This created a particular culture of patience. Anyone connecting to the network knew that every connection was something to be valued. The film captures this feeling surprisingly well, not through technical accuracy, but through atmosphere. Its computers feel like gateways into something larger. Even the act of dialing into a network carries meaning. It marks a transition between two worlds. The actual hacking scenes, of course, differ considerably from reality. Real security research often involves careful investigation, the study of technical documentation, testing individual vulnerabilities, and patiently evaluating the results. Many steps may have to be repeated over the course of hours or days. The work is often quiet, methodical, and far less spectacular than films tend to suggest. A movie that portrayed these processes in complete detail would have to spend long periods showing concentrated analysis. For a broad audience, that would probably have been difficult to make engaging. Hackers therefore chooses another approach. It translates technical processes into visual metaphors. When data appears as streams of light, the film is not claiming that information actually has this visible form. Instead, the imagery conveys the feeling of information moving rapidly through an invisible network. The same principle applies to its portrayal of passwords, firewalls, and security systems. Abstract concepts are transformed into images that can be understood intuitively. Interestingly, many later films adopted similar ideas. For years afterward, computer attacks were often represented through three-dimensional animations, floating graphics, or futuristic interfaces. Not because these things reflected reality, but because they allowed audiences to immediately understand that something important was happening. In this respect, hackers had a lasting influence on the visual language of the genre. Even so, the film contains several surprisingly authentic elements. It uses real terminology from the computer culture of its time. Operating systems, networks, security concepts, and certain technical procedures are at least partially based on technologies that actually existed. The character's interest in telephone networks also reflects historical developments within early hacker culture. The social structure of the group is similarly believable. Hackers really did communicate through bulletin board systems, early internet forums, and personal meetings. Knowledge was shared, programs were developed collectively, and technical problems were discussed among peers. The film exaggerates this community considerably, but its underlying idea has genuine historical roots. Less realistic is the speed with which complex systems can be compromised. In reality, successful security research usually depends on careful preparation. Vulnerabilities first have to be discovered, understood, and reproduced. Many attempts lead nowhere. Breakthroughs often emerge only after considerable patience. Hackers compresses these processes into a matter of minutes. This is not necessarily the result of ignorance. It is a consequence of storytelling. A feature film has to decide which aspects to explore in detail and which to condense. The security measures used by large corporations are also portrayed as considerably simpler than they would be in reality. Even in the mid-1990s, professional administrators, access controls, and protective systems already existed. At the same time, cybersecurity was still a relatively young field. Many of the standards now taken for granted were only introduced or continually refined during the decades that followed. The film therefore reflects less the actual strength of computer systems at the time, than the public perception of what those systems might be capable of. Another interesting aspect concerns the figure of the hacker itself. In the media of that period, the word was often used very broadly. It could describe technically curious programmers, as well as people committing crimes through computers. Today, the distinctions are often more precise. Terms such as white hat, black hat, and ethical hacker describe different approaches to security vulnerabilities. Outside specialist circles, however, these distinctions were far less familiar during the middle of the 1990s. The film itself contributes to this blurring. Its central characters cross legal boundaries, yet they are generally portrayed in morally positive terms. This perspective is understandable within the story, but it simplifies the more complicated ethical questions surrounding digital security. For that reason, the film should not be regarded as either a manual or a realistic depiction of hacking. Its strength lies somewhere else. It makes visible how mysterious computers once appeared to many people. Most viewers had little idea what was actually happening inside a network. Hackers filled that gap in understanding with imagination. From this emerged an aesthetic that still possesses a particular charm. CRT monitors, floppy disks, telephone modems, and oversized keyboards now belong to a bygone era of computer history. What once appeared cutting edge now carries something almost nostalgic. That nostalgia is an important part of the film's enduring cult status. It shows a time when the internet was still young, a time when digital technology did not yet feel ordinary, but mysterious and full of unanswered questions. And perhaps that is precisely why hackers can still fascinate audiences decades later. Not because its technology is accurate, but because it preserves a rare moment when an entire society had begun imagining a completely new digital future, long before anyone knew what that future would actually look like. Not every film becomes a success immediately after its release. Some works find their audience only years later. Hackers belongs to this particular group. During its theatrical run, its commercial performance fell short of expectations. Only gradually did a devoted following emerge, and today the film is regarded as one of the defining works of early cyberculture. This development is remarkable. Many cult films possess a quality that distinguishes them from conventional blockbusters. They do not necessarily appeal to the broadest possible audience at the time of their release. Instead, they speak to people who recognize a very particular atmosphere or attitude within them. This is precisely what happened with hackers. In the middle of the 1990s, director Ian Softly faced an unusual challenge. Computers had already become part of everyday life in many businesses, yet representing them on screen presented filmmakers with considerable difficulties. Much of real computer work consisted of typing commands, reading text windows, and interacting with relatively plain interfaces. For a feature film, there was very little visual movement in any of this. Rather than attempting to reproduce these processes as realistically as possible, the production chose an artistic approach. The goal was not to make computers look realistic. The goal was to make visible what digital connection might feel like. This led to a visual language filled with luminous colors, transparent spaces, and futuristic architecture. Its inspiration came less from computer science than from art, music videos, and the emerging cyberpunk aesthetic of the time. By then, cyberpunk had already become more than a literary genre. Since the 1980s, writers such as William Gibson and Bruce Sterling had imagined future societies in which advanced technology existed alongside profound social divisions. Powerful corporations, global data networks, and individual freedom were often placed in tension with one another. Hackers adopt certain visual elements from this tradition, but its tone is considerably more optimistic. While many cyberpunk stories portray dark visions of the future, this film presents technology primarily as a means of enabling creativity. Its neon colors feel inviting rather than threatening. The city appears alive and full of possibilities. Even the digital realm resembles a playground more than a prison. The costumes contributed greatly to this impression. The characters' clothing combines influences from club culture, streetwear, and futuristic design. Bold patterns, vivid colors, and unusual cuts give the characters a distinctive visual identity. From today's perspective, the style reflects the 1990s very clearly. At the time, many of these designs appeared remarkably modern. Today, they carry a certain nostalgic charm. The same is true of the technology itself. CRT monitors, floppy disks, modems, and large desktop computers now seem almost like artifacts from a museum. Yet they recall an era in which computers were still tangible machines. The hum of cooling fans, the clicking of keyboards, and the sound of connecting through a telephone line were simply part of everyday digital life. These details give the film a kind of authenticity that exists independently of its highly stylized presentation. Another important element of its appeal was the soundtrack. Electronic music was receiving enormous international attention in the middle of the 1990s. Techno, house, industrial, and various forms of electronic dance music were increasingly becoming part of popular culture. Hackers embraced this development and closely connected its imagery with its sound. The result was an unusual unity between music and visual design. Even today, many viewers remember less about individual elements of the plot than about the particular feeling created by this combination. The cast also played an important role. Johnny Lee Miller portrayed Dade Murphy with a mixture of confidence and youthful uncertainty. His character appears talented while remaining approachable at the same time. Angelina Jolie, who was still at the beginning of her international career, left a lasting impression as Kate Libby. Her performance combined composure with technical competence and contributed greatly to making Acid Burn one of the film's most recognizable characters. In retrospect, her role carries an additional historical significance. Only a few years later, Jolie would become one of Hollywood's best-known actresses. As a result, Hackers gained additional attention in retrospect. Its cult status, however, was not created by famous names alone. It developed slowly through home video releases, television broadcasts, and later, DVD editions. People often discovered the film by chance and then recommended it to others. Within technology-oriented communities in particular, Hackers became a familiar point of reference. Many viewers were perfectly aware that its depiction of technology was unrealistic. That was precisely why they did not regard it as a documentary, but rather as an affectionate fantasy about the beginnings of the digital age. Over the years, the public perception of the film also changed. What had initially appeared to be an exaggerated vision of the future increasingly came to be understood as a cultural document of its time. Today, Hackers no longer shows the future. It shows the future as people in 1995 imagined it. That distinction is important. Films always tell us something about the era in which they were created. Their hopes, fears, and expectations often reveal more about their own present than about the future they attempt to portray. This is precisely where the particular historical value of Hackers lies. The film preserves the optimism of a generation that still regarded the internet as a largely open space. Many of today's discussions surrounding privacy, disinformation, algorithmic influence, or digital dependence played a much smaller role in public consciousness at the time. Instead, the prevailing idea was that global connectivity would primarily create new possibilities. That hope can be felt in almost every frame of the film. Its cult status therefore rests on more than its story or its characters. It rests on a feeling, the feeling of witnessing the beginning of a new era. When modern audiences watch the film today, they are not simply encountering a story about hackers. They are also encountering a historical moment in which the digital age was beginning to dream its first great dreams. And perhaps this is the secret behind its remarkably long afterlife. It is not the accuracy of its visions that makes the film unforgettable. It is the sincerity with which it believed in the possibilities of a connected future. When a film continues to be watched and discussed many years after its creation, the question of its lasting value inevitably arises. In the case of Hackers, the answer lies only partly in its story. Much more important is its distinctive perspective on the beginning of the digital age, which continues to make the film interesting today. The film was created at a historical moment when the relationship between people and computers was undergoing a fundamental transformation. Until well into the 1980s, computers were regarded by many people as specialized tools. They existed in businesses, universities, and government institutions, and were operated primarily by professionals. With the growing popularity of home computers and the expanding internet, this perception began to change. Suddenly, the computer became a personal device. It was no longer used exclusively for work. It became a place for learning, communication, play, and creativity. Hackers captures precisely this transformation. Its characters do not regard computers as machines in the conventional sense. They see them as natural parts of their lives. Today, this perspective hardly seems remarkable. In the middle of the 1990s, however, it represented a profound cultural shift. For this reason, the film possesses a particular historical quality. It does not show the digital world as it would eventually become. It shows the digital world before it became ordinary. From today's perspective, many of the hopes of that period can seem almost innocent. The internet was supposed to connect people. Knowledge was supposed to become freely accessible. Hierarchies were expected to lose some of their importance. Borders between countries were supposed to become easier to cross through communication. Some of these expectations genuinely became reality. Never before had people been able to communicate across the world so quickly, exchange scientific knowledge so easily, or collaborate on projects across enormous distances. At the same time, new challenges emerged: privacy, disinformation, digital surveillance, cybercrime, and the concentration of economic power have all become major social issues of the 21st century. Hackers anticipates very little of this. Its perspective remains overwhelmingly optimistic. That is precisely why the film can feel almost like a snapshot of a lost innocence. It recalls a time when the internet was associated primarily with discovery. This historical distance makes the film particularly fascinating, not because its vision of the future came true, but because it reveals the hopes and desires that society once attached to emerging technology. The film also left visible traces within popular culture. Its neon colors, music, dynamic camera work, and stylized representation of digital spaces influenced numerous later productions. Some adopted individual elements of its visual design. Others embraced the broader idea of transforming abstract computer processes into images that could be felt rather than technically understood. Even modern video games, television series, and music videos sometimes reveal echoes of this early cyber aesthetic. The influence of the film is often indirect. Many artists who create digital worlds today grew up with works such as Hackers. Its visual language therefore continues to live on, even as that language constantly evolves. It is also interesting to consider how the meaning of the word hacker has changed since the film was released. Today, many people initially associate the term with cyber attacks or data theft. Within computer science, however, a more nuanced understanding still exists. There, a hacker can also be someone who approaches systems creatively, improves them, or examines their security. That distinction remains important. The film does not provide a realistic depiction of professional cybersecurity work, but it does remind us that technical curiosity does not necessarily imply criminal intent. This idea remains relevant today. Perhaps one of the greatest strengths of Hackers is that the film does not define its characters through technology alone. Computers are tools. What ultimately matters are their friendships, their decisions, and their responsibility toward one another. In this way, the film stands apart from an idea that would become more common in later decades. Technology is not presented as a replacement for human relationships. It expands them. The computers connect people rather than separating them. Whether that hope has been completely fulfilled remains an open question. Digital communication can create closeness across enormous distances. At the same time, it can contribute to isolation, misunderstanding, or dependence. Both realities belong to the present. That is precisely why looking back can be worthwhile. Not to romanticize the past, but to remember the optimism with which many people once approached the beginning of the digital age. Perhaps there is even something to learn from that attitude. Technological progress alone never determines the future. What matters is the values a society connects with its new possibilities. This forms the quiet core of Hackers. The film is not merely about computers. It is about trust, about cooperation, about the desire for knowledge, about the pleasure of discovery, and about the responsibility that grows with every new tool. From today's perspective, its virtual landscapes may appear nostalgic. Its computers seem slow. Its screens appear small. Its networks look simple. Yet all of these details become less important when the film is viewed as a cultural document. It preserves the memory of a particular historical moment, a brief period when the internet still felt like an unexplored continent, a place filled with possibilities, a place whose maps were only beginning to be drawn. Perhaps this is precisely why Hackers has retained its distinctive atmosphere. Not every prediction made by the film came true. Not every technological idea proved accurate. But its central message reaches far beyond computers. It reminds us that curiosity is one of the strongest forces behind human development. That knowledge brings responsibility, and that every generation eventually enters its own unknown territories. The digital landscapes of Hackers may now belong to the past. The questions raised by the film do not. They return with every new technological development. And as computers, networks, and artificial intelligence continue to change, the fundamental challenge remains much the same as it was then. Not simply to create increasingly powerful tools, but to learn how to use them with care, openness, and humanity. In this sense, Hackers ultimately becomes less a story about computers than a quiet reminder that behind every technology, there are always human beings, with their hopes, their creativity, and their responsibility for the world they create together. Hackers holds a distinctive place in the history of cinema. It is neither a realistic thriller about computer security nor an accurate prediction of the digital future. Its true value lies elsewhere. It preserves the atmosphere of a historical moment when the internet still appeared to be a largely unknown realm, open, mysterious, and filled with possibilities. For that reason, the film now feels almost like a time capsule. Its computer technology may be outdated, and its visual effects may appear highly stylized from a modern perspective. Yet beneath that surface, it explores subjects that have lost none of their relevance: curiosity, identity, responsibility, the use of knowledge, and the question of how technological developments reshape the way human beings live together. For modern audiences, this creates a double perspective. On one level, the film can be enjoyed as a nostalgic glimpse into the early days of the digital age. On another, it invites us to reflect upon the present. Many of the hopes of the 1990s have become reality, while others have been accompanied by entirely new challenges. It is precisely this contrast that makes Hackers worth returning to. As a story to be heard rather than simply watched, the film reveals a surprisingly quiet quality. Beneath the neon colors, the music, and the stylized networks lies a story about the human desire to explore unknown worlds. Cyberspace becomes a symbol of something much older: the urge to cross boundaries, understand hidden connections, and share knowledge with others. And in the end, what remains is perhaps less the memory of spectacular computer imagery than a simple realization. Every age creates its own tools. But the questions human beings ask themselves remain remarkably similar. How should we use new knowledge? How do we preserve freedom without losing our sense of responsibility? And how do we create a future in which technological possibilities continue to serve humanity rather than the other way around? With these thoughts, the journey through the world of hackers comes quietly to an end. Like the faint hiss of an old modem, the film reminds us that every great transformation once began with something small, a connection, a curious glance, and the willingness to step into territory that had not yet been explored.